PlayStation 5 is now just over 5 years old, and it does seem very weird to say that. I think a lot of us are coming to the same conclusion of, oh my god, I cannot believe it's already been 5 years. But sure enough, the initial COVID delays, supply constraints, the apparent lack of games, and here we are. It feels like the console generation hasn't even really gotten started. Or at least that's how it feels for some people. For me, I find that the console at 5 years in has done very well, but that's what's been so fascinating about the conversation surrounding PS5 so far. It's been 5 years, right? There's 2 more years until PS6, we assume, and PS5 will surely be very relevant beyond PlayStation 6. So it's not like the console has to be defined by this first 5 years. But 5 years is definitely plenty to where I'm not sure it will be able to shake off this general sentiment surrounding it, and that it feels like nothing has happened, or at least because of those, again, supply constraints, these very long game dev cycles, and PlayStation's push into the live service segment, which has had a lot of missteps so far, it's going to be very hard for the console to shake off that sort of identity crisis. And I find that to be a bit of a shame because this was always apparent to me, even on day one of PlayStation 5, is that it had this sort of unusual benefit that we don't often see in the console segment. And that, sure, it's got backwards compatibility, and that's a big boon to the playability of it on day one, because every single console, when it comes out on day one, it's day one. There is no library compared to what it's going to look like 1, 2, 3 years down the road, right? No matter what, every console is going to start off slow. But PlayStation 5, by virtue of backwards compatibility and the super fast SSD and boosting PS4 games retroactively and just getting better frame rates, higher resolutions for the games that are dynamic, you almost immediately got this benefit that you don't often see with prior console cycles. The console made sense to pick up even on day one. And that's without the hindsight of the console got more expensive over time, right? But ignoring that, it was immediately playable and enjoyable. And that's also ignoring the fact that day one did have some strong first-party games, and there has been first-party output, not just from PlayStation Studios, which includes first and second-party now at this point, but also just strong third-party support as well. This is one of those things where I think we could easily list off a handful of games. You know, your Demon's Souls, Spider-Man Miles Morales, Spider-Man 2, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. Insomniac has done an incredible job on this console. You have your Horizon Forbidden West, God of War Ragnarok, Returnal, Astrobot, Gran Turismo 7, Ghost of Yotei, other second-party but first-party game experiences that are still under PS Studios, like Stellar Blade, Rise of the Ronin, Helldivers 2. You have third-party agreements and these exclusives that are timed on PlayStation 5, like your Final Fantasy 16 and 7 Rebirth, Silent Hill 2, and then just general third-party games, Alan Wake 2, Baldur's Gate 3, smaller things like Balatro. It becomes a bit of a list war, and that's what's, I guess, also very complicated about talking about games in today's environment, is that it's turned into a bit of a list war thing, which can be proposed and propped up in a very different way depending on who's making the argument, what kind of narrative they're trying to pull here, because then it sort of boils down to, well, those games don't count. This game doesn't count because it was on PS4. It was on PC. It's the argument I've made before. I still feel very strongly about this, and that even though there may be a cross-gen game and it's available on PS4, well, we can see that people are still buying PS5s at the same rate that they pretty much always did with prior console cycles. Today's consumers are very eager to buy new machines, buy the PS5 versions of those games, and they're console buyers. It just simply has not mattered that these games are also available on PC. The games are exclusive enough to where there's still that benefit of, if you choose to play on PlayStation 5, you are getting the PS5 console exclusive experience with these titles in particular. The sort of aggression Sony has had for exclusivity has not really been lost on PlayStation 5, I find. And so you're still getting a lot of these experiences that you otherwise were not going to get if you stuck with PS4 or if you were to go over to Xbox. Now, obviously, that's a whole other can of worms as far as where Xbox looks like nowadays, but I digress. The point is, there's so many games we could list off, and that's the other very odd spectrum of the conversation to have, and that, you know, it really falls on a studio by studio basis. We can say all day, every day that it's been a massive disappointment that certain studios like Media Molecule, Bend Studio, Bluepoint, in particular Naughty Dog, have gone through most of this PlayStation 5 cycle without shipping a sort of brand new experience, right? Discounting a remake or a port, things of that nature. And that's where those missteps do come in. But it always falls on a studio by studio basis. I am greatly disappointed with where those studios fell in recent years, especially because we are talking about 6, 7, 8 year dev cycles, and it's very tough to establish new IPs. We are expecting, thankfully, that we'll have something like Intergalactic. There's also Marvel's Wolverine on the horizon. There's Saros, which I'm very excited for from Housemarque. So these games are still coming. I think there's a plentiful amount of surprises that we'll see as we go into the final 2 years of PlayStation 5 before PlayStation 6. I say final because, just assuming that the next console cycle is 2 years away. But you can look at all the missteps, and it's a studio by studio thing. There's just the weird push and pull of, well, there's just been so many games, period. And that's why it's even hard to have that list war argument to begin with, because no matter how you phrase it, this generation has had a massive amount of games, and I don't think anybody reasonably has this much time to play and enjoy this much stuff that is out there. Maybe you're very picky, it depends on the genres that you're into. I mean, I can't explain that for you, of course, but I find that with how many games come out nowadays, it is overwhelming, let's say. And so with PlayStation 5, a console that has these amazing quality of life improvements with load times pretty much being gone, boosting any sort of previous generation games, and just being a no compromise experience as far as a nice clean UI that sets up all your games on that horizontal row, and you can launch them and just get into your games as fast as possible. The console experience so far with PS5 and the amount of games that have been out across third, second, and first party has been very strong and very compelling. I don't like to make arguments like these too often as far as comparing directly, but I mean, a sort of holistic comparison would simply be, you could look at PlayStation 2, for example, a console that has been well known for its vast library of games and how that really runs the gamut of the experiences you can have on PS2, and it's just a sort of behemoth in the games business, or the games in games history rather, right? You can look at PS2's library, it's in the thousands, and PlayStation 5 is like twofold. It's 12,000 something PS5 games. I mean, it's unbelievable how many games are coming out nowadays. And I don't want to say quantity automatically means better, but I think you can understand just the sheer volume of stuff that does come out nowadays versus the PlayStation 2, and it runs the gamut possibly far more than PS2 ever reasonably could see, when you can choose between the free-to-play stuff, smaller bite-sized experiences, and then all these new studios that are forming and putting out different types of games that come out. And then there's still the AAA familiar, which, are few and far between, don't get me wrong, because we're talking about 6, 7 year dev cycles, and that's why it sounds and feels very annoying for maybe some of your favorite studios. But it's that combined with everything else that sort of stacks up, and we have a release cadence of games that just feels very overwhelming. And we have a console experience that's been so refined as far as the fast load times, a robust online interface, and let's also not even ignore the fact that we have 60 FPS on consoles in a way that has been so consistent. The vast majority of PlayStation 5 games have been 60 FPS, and that is an entirely new concept versus prior consoles. It's not like 60 FPS didn't exist on PS3, PS2, PS1. PS1 was certainly more common than I think some people tend to remember. Same with PlayStation 2. That was very genre dependent, where typically you'd see 60 FPS on certain types of genres. But, PlayStation 5 across the board, it is highly unusual to only have a 30 FPS game. So we're now getting high frame rates, higher resolutions. PlayStation 5 Pro has had some rough starts with PSSR, Sony's internal semi-proprietary AI upscaler, which will hopefully be a lot better going into 2026. But to sort of end off the game conversation, I just feel like there has been so much happening that it would be a bit of a shame that the live service troubles with your Concord, your Destruction All-Stars, the cancellations at Ben Studio, The Last of Us Online, Blue Point's God of War thing, the Twisted Metal project. We know there's been some challenges in that segment, but all of that can happen, and yet we still had so much else to prop up the generation, and that's where it becomes a little bit uneven in my eyes. Now, there's also PlayStation VR2. I want to quickly acknowledge this, which I still think is primarily a virtual reality problem. It's a marketplace, and that It's, sure, a very expensive headset that is tethered to a PlayStation 5, and I would have loved to see Sony invest more in this space from first party, but they can't reasonably do that. They can't tie up their existing studios with VR games that are not going to sell even remotely close to what they would sell if they were 2D experiences. But I would have loved to see some investment in other new VR studios, kind of how they've approached this with live service games in general, and that they oftentimes do scout out and sign on other studios so that that's not impeding on the first party output quite to the degree that people think is happening, right? It's happening a little bit with like Naughty Dog and Ben, for example, but I think you get my point. I think that would have been the best way to approach VR. They have not gone about that. We've only had Horizon Call of the Mountain, Gran Turismo 7, Firewall Ultra, but PSVR 2 is still a very performant headset, and there are still a lot of VR games coming out from third-party studios. Pools just dropped. Cave Crave really blew up. There's RoboQuest VR, and there's more in the pipeline as well for VR games that are shipping on PlayStation VR2, which are more complete packages versus what you find on MetaQuest or Steam VR. So you are sort of getting a virtual reality experience that's a bit more tailored in that manner. You're not necessarily getting the shovelware and fluff that you see flood the MetaQuest headset, for example. So in a way, that is almost a benefit for PSVR2, but that can still be a detriment as far as some games skipping VR2 entirely. But VR2, I wish it could be so much better than where it is right now, but I don't want to undersell how good of a headset it can be if you like and enjoy virtual reality, and I love VR so much. So PSVR 2 didn't really pan out the way I was hoping it would, but it's definitely still got some value, and it's still receiving that value today. Now, I also want to touch on the DualSense. I think this is kind of an open and shut case. I love this thing. It's pretty much the best PlayStation controller out there. It's comfortable. It feels sturdy. The battery life is disappointing, sure. There's a new revision that came out that does improve that substantially, which is fantastic to see. But the DualSense haptics and triggers has been something where when games do not really lean into those, I'm disappointed, genuinely. I mean, it's great that you have a handful of first-party games that really showcase what the controller is capable of. And it may seem a little bit gimmicky, but I've never really liked the word gimmicky. It feels very thoughtful in its approach to how it can really elevate a game experience. I mean, it's a sensory experience too. I mean, that's the point of PlayStation 5 when we consider the hardware and how Sony has marketed this machine. This was Sony already acknowledging in 2020 that we know we're in diminishing returns as far as how games visually look. That's why we have 60 FPS now, because there's just that much headroom at this point. So with those diminishing returns for visual fidelity, Sony acknowledged that we needed some new sensory experiences on this platform cycle. That's why you have things like 3D audio, which has been hit or miss for me personally. That might depend greatly on how I interpret sound, but also the haptics and triggers for the DualSense controller. I love it. The only big problem is that I daily a DualSense Edge, and I like that controller a lot, but I am having the bubbling issue on the back with the rubber pads on both my original DualSense Edge and now my 30th anniversary Edge. That is a huge bummer as far as quality control, and I really wish this was something that Sony would have been a little bit more careful with long-term testing being done on those rubber pads. That was a huge misfire, and it's a bummer that for such an expensive controller, it is showing these signs within a year. Now, speaking of the DualSense Edge, that's a great segue to the product ecosystem for PlayStation. I think there's a lot to be said about the PS mobile experience, the mobile app rather, so that's been very robust. It's not as fast and snappy as I would like. It still feels very much like a like a PlayStation-made application. The 2025 version of the PS mobile app is very feature complete, I would say. There's a lot of what you can do and what you can expect to do on the app. There's basic messaging, but of course surfing the store, downloading things, sending that to the console. It is, for the most part, feature complete. I just don't really like how it still feels a little bit slow, a little bit sluggish, and you don't get that responsiveness that certain other applications have on iOS and Android. Now, having said that, the Pulse Elite, the Pulse Explorer, I didn't think I would be using PlayStation branded headsets outside of PlayStation. So they've made some very nice headsets that have genuine application outside of the hardware, and it's nice having the sort of downstream effect of Sony acquiring that one company. So now they have planar magnetic drivers in the headsets, in the Pulse Explorer earbuds, and so the audio quality is excellent. I love it, and I've actually been using the Pulse Explorer more and more than my AirPods just to listen to music on my phone. And that also extends to a device like the PlayStation Portal, which it is a bummer that you have to use Sony's proprietary PS Link technology for that protocol on the PS Portal. That's the only way you can get a wireless headset on the Portal in the here and now without some sort of big gap in the input, or the audio latency rather. But the Portal itself, also a very surprising device. I think that caught a lot of people off guard, and that while it seems like just a big screen with a DualSense cut in half, it turns out it's a very capable remote play device, and it makes it so conducive to certain experiences being played on your couch in your home network, and you could take it outside of your home network. Now, for me, that has been not a great experience. I'm much more sensitive to any sort of input latency. It really bothers me when I can feel it more so than if I'm in my home network. And even in my home network, depending on the experience I'm playing on the Portal, if it's a very fast kinetic game, or even something in the middle, like I can feel it a lot easier, and so it does bother me a lot. So I tend to stick to very slow-paced static experiences on the Portal, but it's still a device that I didn't think I'd be using it as much as I do. And so the Portal has also been really complementary to the PlayStation 5 product ecosystem. Sony, I think at this point in time, has done very well with the ecosystem. I think it can go a step further on PlayStation 6. All these devices, they do work well with each other, but it's not totally there. You know, sometimes syncing the PS Link devices to the Portal back to the PS5 can be a pain. We did have a recent firmware where DualSense controllers can now, you know, hot swap between devices, and that, for the most part, has been very easy as well. There were a handful of times where it got lost for me as far as the hot swapping feature, and so you have to reset it up, and that can always be a pain. That's the last thing you want to do, right? When you can get to an ecosystem that feels so natural as far as being able to bounce around these different devices and they all speak so well to each other, that's where it really keeps you into that ecosystem in a way where you don't feel compelled to even consider other options. You just go, oh, okay, PlayStation's making this now, new desktop speakers. Oh, that's great. That's going to fit in nicely with everything else I have going on. When it feels like that, then they've reached a certain level of customer satisfaction. And I would hope they get that, and they can achieve it with perhaps a new product lineup on PlayStation 6. Last thing I want to cover is PlayStation Plus, the big relaunch in mid-2022, which consolidated PS Plus and also PlayStation Now into 3 tiers of service: Essential, Extra, and Premium. And so this has, for the most part, been, I want to say, good. It does suck with how expensive these subscriptions are at this point in time. Extra and Premium, over $100 for a year, is a lot of money. And I think no matter how many games you throw into the service, at a certain point, it doesn't matter how much it costs. There is simply not enough time to play or enjoy all of those games. This is sort of why Game Pass is right now finding itself in that same position of, well, at a certain point, it is too much money no matter what you're throwing into the service. And I find that PS Plus Extra and Premium are just teetering on the edge of that issue. And for Premium, it's tough because it's only a little bit more than PS Plus Extra, but you're getting the classic games, you're getting the PS5 game streaming. The game streaming for PlayStation 5 server blades are very impressive. It is something where you don't necessarily need to do it because in the grand scheme of things, you can only stream PS5 games on a PS5 console or the Portal, and the Portal is a much better use case for that. So if anything, that recently unlocked a new level of usability for PS5 game streaming, because conceivably you're not really going to be using that too often directly on the PlayStation 5 console. You would much rather just download it locally. But the server blades have been very impressive. It's something where it will blow you away with the image quality and the latency from Sony servers. Having said that, I am more of an old-fashioned person, so The classic games were always very appealing to me. We recently covered why it takes so long for those classic games to come out. It's just, well, it's an issue with the licensing, hidden costs, publisher relations. There is a lot of hurdles that a company like Implicit Conversions has to get over in order to have a very consistent release cadence on PlayStation Plus Premium. So it's been pretty much abysmal that 1 month goes by and we get 1, maybe up to 3 games on Premium. If you love classic games, it has been a nightmare slow rollout. With that said, no matter what, even if it's only 1 to 3 at a time per month, eventually they do build a library. So we are up to a decent amount of PS1, PS2, and PSP games. Would I love more? Absolutely, but at the very minimum, it is a really neat thing to see with PSP and PS1 games now having this new life on PlayStation 5, and these games being exposed to a new audience as well. And really, it would be more fair to say that there's that part of PlayStation Plus Premium, but also just publishers generally are exploring their back catalog more often. So I feel like it's kind of hard to talk about Premium without, we can't just ignore the fact that we have all those games coming back, but also everything else is coming back. And so as far as like older classic games, there has been this renaissance in the last 4 or 5-ish years to where if it's not on Sony's program, that's probably because it's coming back in a different way. So no matter what, you do kind of get to have your cake and eat it too, which I really enjoy. But that is, for the most part, what I wanted to say about PlayStation 5. I wanted to go into this a bit unscripted because, I think you could spend all day really looking at the minute details of how these 5 years have gone so far, but holistically speaking, I would be lying to myself if I said I haven't thoroughly enjoyed this console cycle. I think there's just so much there, and in a way, it is maybe a bit of a shame that the general consensus in the online circles does tend to be that, oh, this is the cycle that barely feels like it got off the ground, and we've had nothing but live service games and failures left and right. And it's like, well, if you don't look at those things, if you don't care for them, I certainly don't. I'm not a live service person whatsoever, and I feel like I'm having the time of my life when I get to actually sit down and play video games. So it's one of those things, right? It's all about perspective, and PlayStation 5 so far has been a console that has been a very refined PS4 experience and then some, maybe is the better way to put it. I'm not sure how complimentary that really sounds, but PlayStation 5 has been fun. I've really enjoyed the generation so far. But with that in mind, curious to hear what everyone else thinks, so thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.